I believe, Jake, I think I'm going to turn it over to you. Is this where we have our survey results? Is this,
Yep.
are we hearing from the Attorney General now?
No, at this point, I would give a review, a baseline review of the survey results that we've aggregated, and then we can have a discussion, or the task force can have a discussion based upon what information this shows. And at this point, I'll share my screen so that everyone can view this presentation. And
yeah, please proceed. Thank you.
I'm happy to entertain questions throughout or at the end, whatever folks prefer. All right. So as you'll recall, I think it was at our second meeting where we discussed the idea of a standardized survey to be sent to all local law enforcement agencies throughout Rhode Island regarding the implication and the use of the law enforcement officers' Bill of Rights in their department over the last 5 years. At the behest of some members, we requested the data at an annualized basis over the last 5 years, as well as it was a recommendation of the committee that we inquired as to what the discipline was issued for, a quote-unquote summary of the charges. I'm happy to report that 37 of the 38 local law enforcement agencies in Rhode Island participated and responded to the survey. It is important to note from the outset the responses reflect each one's own unique circumstances, whether it's local collective bargaining agreements, how they collect data internally, how they process discipline internally, how they also administer that discipline, and also their record keeping, and last but not least, how they interpreted the survey results as well. I think, can everyone hear me all right at this point, and the slides are clear enough? Okay. The top line overview, I think, shows a few things. And again, this is an aggregation of data from the 37 law enforcement agencies that filled out this grid that looks just as it does on the screen. So row A is the number of instances that the participating agencies administered discipline during that year. Row B is the number of discipline cases over the last 5 years that did not result in a hearing under the provision of the Law Enforcement Officers' Bill of Rights. C would be the number of hearings that occurred. D is the number of hearings that resulted in a finding of guilt by the panel. And column H down at the bottom is when the hearing panel decided to decrease the amount of discipline that was recommended by the chief. What you'll notice from the outset is that A, B, and C do not all add up. I'll discuss that a little bit further in a future slide, but what this top line shows is that of the 37 participating agencies, the one agency that we did not receive a response from was South Kingstown PD. There were 4 hearing panels that adjudicated discipline through the Law Enforcement Officers' Bill of Rights. Another way of saying that is that in discipline instances that could have progressed to LEOBoR and a panel was codified, 4 panels met and weighed in on the decision of a chief administering discipline. And in 2 of those 4, the discipline was decreased. Column I is the amount that the local law enforcement agencies approximated the cost of a hearing panel at, and the LEOBoR process. What I would like to do is discuss a little further this discrepancy between A, B, and C. But before I move on, I would just say that this survey was modeled after a 1995 survey by a similar task force that did a 3-year look back. And in that survey, there were 36 instances of LEOBoR hearing panels convening and adjudicating discipline. At this point, does anyone have any questions? So this chart hopes to instruct on the number of times discipline was administered, as well as those number of cases that did not progress to a LEOBoR hearing panel. And as you can tell from the little maroon bar there, the number of times that a hearing panel met and adjudicated discipline. Chief Clements may be able to speak to this at the end. What we saw from a number of different agencies was that they interpreted question B, annual number of discipline cases over the last 5 years that did not result in a hearing under the provisions of the Bill of Rights, differently. So, for example, if a local law enforcement agency administered discipline 50 times and all 50 of those did not go to a LEOBoR, some agencies took the extra step of filling in that next line with 50, and others summarily left it blank. That said, none of that should be interpreted to, at that juncture, impact the final result of the fact that there have been 4 LEOBoR panels convened over the last 5 years. Of those 4, this is just a breakdown of where and when they occurred. 3 were in 2015, and 1 was in Pawtucket in 2018 regarding a 2017 incident. Each one of these panels reported a finding of guilty, and 2 panels recommended a reduced punishment than the one offered by the chief. To be clear, I do not have the details of what those recommended punishments were, nor the punishment finalized by the LEOBoR hearing panel. This is just a breakdown of the cost data that was provided by those agencies where they provide the data. Woonsock did not provide data as to the approximate cost of a LEOBoR hearing panel, and as far as attorney's fees and so forth. North Providence approximated the cost of $25,000. Pawtucket at $36,000, which appears to be an exact figure, probably based upon bills submitted by the attorneys. And Providence, not only did they detail their prosecution cost, but also the decision was appealed up, and there was an additional cost for that. As you may recall, we included a question soliciting input from chiefs as far as their comments on the process itself. As you may surmise on your own, based upon the data that has been submitted to us, the majority of agencies have not gone through the LEOBoR panel process over the last 5 years, and their comments reflect this. I thought it just might be instructive to put a few of these on the screen, as well as maybe articulate a narrative as to what you'll also see as far as the chief's respective thoughts on the importance of allowing some criminal investigations to play out before a LEOBoR goes into effect, before the hearing panel plays out their role. From Cranston, once the hearing is convened, it progresses in a reasonable amount of time. However, we had an occurrence when criminal charges led to a delay in the hearing, which was unreasonable. From Colonel Brown in East Greenwich, where actually one officer resigned as a result of charges they faced. I believe that most of the delays of LEOBoR are due to criminal cases. However, because of the intricacies of these types of cases and their outcomes, there does not seem to be a clear solution to speeding up the LEOBoR cases prior to the adjudication of the criminal case. From Foster, and it is important to note that while some of these chiefs acquiesced to the fact that they had not encountered LEOBoR during their own tenure as chief, many of them come from backgrounds on the Rhode Island State Police where they may have sat on a hearing panel themselves or played another role. So in a lot of ways, this was a 360-degree perspective from them rather than just their perspective as a local chief. Chief and Foster, in my experience in law enforcement, the Bill of Rights often takes an inordinate amount of time. It is understandable when criminal charges are involved, but when only departmental charges are involved, the process, in my opinion, needs to be streamlined. From Chief Goncalves in Pawtucket, I believe the disciplinary proceedings that progress to a LEOBoR hearing are handled in a reasonable amount of time after criminal charges are adjudicated. While a case progressing through the criminal justice system can be time-consuming and delay disciplinary actions, it is paramount for criminal charges to be adjudicated prior to any disciplinary action. From Chief in Gloucester, categorical no, the police officer's Bill of Rights has worked well in Rhode Island, whether criminal charges have been filed or not. However, the hearing should be streamlined and time-sensitive for efficiency and cost. I thought this was an instructive comment from the chief in North Providence. I was appointed chief of the North Providence Police Department in January 2020. I have little experience with the LEOBoR from my current position within this agency. Prior to joining the North Providence Police Department in 2018, I was employed with the Pawtucket Police Department for 28 years. I have knowledge and experience in some cases involving my tenure with the Pawtucket PD. Some of those LEOBoR cases were not handled a reasonable amount of time. Several cases involved criminal charges that caused a delay in resolving the case. In some matters, several years transpired prior to decision being declared. In other matters that did not include criminal charges, delays were caused by scheduling conflicts between the principal parties involved. At this point, I did aggregate all of the charges regarding discipline that were submitted as part of the survey. They differed in a number of ways, almost one could say in 38 different ways. Every department has a different process for categorizing their infraction based upon their submission to this task force. For example, one department may just categorize it as neglect of duty, while another department may not only categorize it as neglect of duty, but several other circumstances that are qualified it as that. So to summarily categorize each instance of discipline and break them out in a chart would have been rather difficult, but certainly there is a list of all the disciplinary charges. The difficulty in categorizing them, however, would arise from the fact that two instances, one maybe never should be treated the same. However, they, very infrequently, while across the same department may be treated the same and documented the same, across two different departments, they are not. Discipline also arose based upon who initiated it. What you'll see when you review the discipline charges is that there are those that are initiated within and by the local law enforcement agency itself for duty violations. That is the vast majority of these. There are also ones that are initiated by civilians, and there are also ones that are initiated by outside law enforcement agencies, largely for criminal activity that the officer did outside their line of duty. And then what you'll also see, based upon the responses to us, or to the task force rather, is that each agency categorized and described the discipline that they administered in different ways. Some were forthcoming in describing it, whether it was a written reprimand, verbal reprimand, suspension. Others just listed the charges. So again, to try to provide any sort of consistent narrative across the state as far as a matrix of discipline or a progression of discipline would not have been possible purely based on the responses we received. This is a breakdown of just some of the more prominent occurrences of violations that are necessitated discipline. First, I would categorize it as administrative violations. Like I said, neglect of duty, violation of department rules and regs, a large amount of motor vehicle operation violations. And together, these amounted to the vast majority of the disciplines that were handed out, or at least the causes arising to discipline. There were criminal charges that required discipline from local chiefs. There were several instances of this where, at least as provided by the chiefs, and those were noted in the individual agency responses. And then there were also civilian initiated investigations. Again, this only becomes clear based upon the information that was provided by the local law enforcement agency. In a later slide, I'll show how some agencies actually broke this down for us in their report versus others. It was not necessarily clear who initiated the discipline. Again, this just kind of shows the four main categories, whether it was internal from the agency, whether it was by another officer, by the chief, whether it was a civilian or an outside agency, as I said, usually for criminal conduct that occurred outside the line of duty. Just two different approaches that local law enforcement agencies undertake when reporting discipline in the information they provided to us. One is just a basic breakdown of allegations, individual allegations, as you'll see, reported for duty, use of property. Others go on to further delineate exactly what that neglect of duty means. So to try to come up with a quantitative count and observation of these that could compare apples to apples really would not be possible. And then I just would like to also draw attention to this, which I found helpful, especially within the context of Mr. DeLauro's testimony regarding a kind of a standardized procedure, a statewide procedure for monitoring and documenting discipline. This came by way of one local law enforcement agency, how they broke down their annual number of discipline cases. Again, you'll see that while there may be a more straightforward way of describing what the discipline is, it does also break down where it initiated from. So this was from the Warwick Police Department, and they went so far as to break down whether the complaints were citizen-driven versus whether they were internal complaints. And then the one thing I would like to end with, and I know Chief Clements has some comments on this and some follow-up discussions that we had, is oftentimes what you'll see when you review the individual survey results is that criminal charges often lead to resignation or retirement. In East Greenwich, criminal charges preceded the resignation of one officer. In Providence, they've had a lot of times, and I'll let the chief speak for himself, what they've seen is that when discipline does rise to a certain threshold, the officer usually ends up resigning or retiring. And this was indicative also in the result or the response provided by Tiverton, where 2 retirements were preceded by criminal charges being brought against officers for stuff that outside, I would say, actions that unfolded outside their scope of duty relating to financial matters. So at this point, Senator, I do know that Chief Clements did want to expand upon his point as it related to Providence Police Department. But before maybe he goes, that is my last slide. I'm happy to discuss what I saw and then also how maybe we'd like to provide this information to the task force members.
Okay, before the chief comes on, does anyone have any observations or questions for Jake?